Welcome to BFR Radio, a podcast dedicated to all things blood flow restriction training. This podcast is proudly sponsored by the BFR.co, where if you want to buy your own BFR cuffs, access online BFR training programs, or you want more information about this type of training, this is your one place to go. And I'm your host, Dr. Chris Gavilio. Welcome back to BFR Radio and this series on using BFR to assist with injuries. Our first few episodes focused on using BFR to improve outcome for ACL injuries. This quickly went from a 2 to a 3-part series. And for this episode, we're going to stick with the lower body, but we're going to focus on another hot topic, in particular, the hamstring injuries. This could be a nice plug for a recent journal article that I got published in the Journal of Sports. It was a case report of the accelerated hamstring rehab that I did with Cedric Dubler, Olympic decathlete, where in 17 days we're able to get him back after a grade 2B hamstring with tendon involvement. For context, the rehab to get you back to full training can typically take up to 4 weeks. So to get him rehabbed and back competing within 17 days is totally remarkable. I won't go through this one here, but if you do want to read it, a Google Scholar search will find it for you and search the title, Accelerating an Olympic Decathlete's Return to Competition Using High-Frequency Blood Flow Restriction Training, a case report. For today's episode, I'm going to review 2 articles that look at using BFR for the eccentric hamstring curl and a Nordic hamstring exercise. So let's get into it. Firstly, when we talk about hamstring injuries, one thing that almost everyone should agree upon across rehab, performance, and research is that eccentric strength matters. Hamstrings are exposed to extremely high forces during sprinting, particularly in late swing, and deficits in eccentric capacity are consistently linked to both initial injury risk and re-injury. The ability to produce high eccentric force lowers the relative risk of injury associated with sprinting. Therefore, the return to an athlete's pre-injury resistance training program after a hamstring injury is emphasized to mitigate re-injury risk resulting from additional strength loss. Depending on the seriousness of the hamstring injury, this can be quite a considerable timeout even before high-load resistance training is no longer contraindicated, delaying an athlete's return to pre-injury resistant training regimes. That's why high-load eccentric exercises, and particularly the Nordic hamstring exercise, have become a central part of both prevention and rehab models. As we are aware, low-load blood flow restriction training has been identified as an effective training alternative with comparable strength and hypertrophy outcomes to traditional high-load resistance training. Although BFR training has been studied extensively, the clinical implications associated with eccentric hamstring training have not. In the work I did with Cedric's rehab, we included hamstring exercise lowers in his program, but it was a multifaceted and inclusive BFR program and didn't isolate eccentric hamstring exercise with BFR per se. Furthermore, in the real world, just like coaching Cedric in the early to mid-stage rehab, or during congested training periods, high-load eccentrics aren't always appropriate or possible. Athletes may not tolerate them, tissues may not be ready, or the overall training load may already be high. And that's where BFR training starts to become interesting, not as a replacement for eccentric loading forever, but as a tool for managing load, volume, and fatigue while still driving meaningful adaptation. So in this episode, I want to talk you through 2 studies that look at BFR and eccentric hamstring training from slightly different angles. And when you put them together, they give us a very useful framework for decision making. Let's start with the first study published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research by Jones and colleagues, and the title is Low Load with BFR versus High Load without BFR. Eccentric hamstring training have similar outcome on muscle adaptation. The key question here was simple but important. Can low-load eccentric hamstring training with BFR produce similar adaptations to traditional high-load eccentric training without the same mechanical stress? This study used a within-subject crossover design where each participant trained one leg using low-load eccentric leg curls with BFR and the other leg using high-load eccentrics without BFR. Both legs were trained twice a week for 6 weeks, which aligns well with common eccentric hamstring prescriptions in both rehab and performance settings. For both groups, they performed a single leg hamstring curl with an emphasis on a slow, controlled eccentric lowering phase over 3 seconds. The concentric phase was assisted by the researcher, ensuring the hamstrings were primarily exposed to eccentric stress rather than concentric fatigue. For the low-load BFR group, 30% of 1RM was used. The rep and set structure followed the classic 75 rep protocol, which was set 1, 30 reps, followed by 3 sets of 15 repetitions. 30 seconds rest was given between the sets, and the cuffs remained inflated continuously during both the work and rest periods. And the cuffs remain inflated during both the work and rest periods, maintaining continuous metabolic stress throughout the block. From a rehab perspective, this is a very joint-friendly stimulus, but one that is still quite demanding locally. The other leg was the traditional eccentric condition. For this, the same unilateral leg curl exercise was used. The load, it was set at 80% of 1RM, and participants completed 3 sets of 10 repetitions. And the rest was the same at 30 seconds between sets. Moving on to the results, and the researchers assessed 4 main outcomes. Firstly, eccentric hamstring strength, measured using a Nord board, and it was reported in newtons. Single leg vertical jump height as a proxy for unilateral lower limb power. Perceived muscle soreness on a scale between 0 and 10. And immediately post-session and 24 hours, a measure of muscle swelling. Firstly, looking at eccentric hamstring strength as measured using a Nord board. I'm sure we're all familiar with what that is. Starting with the traditional high load condition, which was performed at 80% of 1 repetition maximum. Eccentric hamstring strength significantly increased from approximately 292 to 331 newtons post-intervention. This represents an absolute increase of around 39 newtons, or roughly a 12.5% improvement. The low-load BFR condition, where the participants performed their training at 30% of 1 repetition maximum, the eccentric hamstring strength significantly increased also from 294 newtons at baseline to approximately 323 newtons after the intervention. That's an absolute increase of 29 newtons, corresponding to a 9.4% improvement. So both interventions clearly worked. Both produced meaningful and statistically significant improvements in eccentric hamstring strength over the 6-week training period. Comparing the changes between both training methods, the difference was not statistically significant and the between group effect size was small. In practical terms, that tells us that low load eccentric training with BFR produces strength gains that were statistically and practically comparable to traditional high-load eccentric training. For single leg vertical jump height, which was used as a proxy for unilateral single leg power, in the traditional high-load condition, jump height improved by about 2.3%, which just reached statistical significance with a small effect size. In the BFR condition, jump height improved by about 1.5%. This change was not statistically significant. Importantly, there was no significant difference between conditions for changes in jump performance. That's not particularly surprising because this program was designed to target eccentric strength rather than explosive power, and neither condition produced meaningful power-specific adaptations. Muscle soreness was also tracked, both immediately post-training and 24 hours later. In both conditions, soreness increased immediately after training and then significantly decreased by the 24-hour mark. There were no significant differences between the BFR and high-load conditions at any time point. In other words, low-load BFR eccentrics did not result in greater or more prolonged soreness than traditional high-load eccentrics. Where the two conditions really differed was in the measurement of muscle swelling, which the authors assessed using a bioelectrical impedance phase angle. A decrease in phase angle ratio suggests an increase in the amount of extracellular water compared with intracellular water, and an increase in phase angle suggests the opposite. Thus, the phase angle measurement can be useful in identifying changes in muscle swelling. In the traditional high-load condition, there was essentially no change in phase angle following training. In contrast, the BFR condition showed a significant and large decrease in phase angle of approximately 4.4% immediately post-exercise. This suggests that low-load eccentric training with BFR created a much larger local swelling response than traditional high-load eccentrics. The significance here is that from a mechanistic standpoint, muscle swelling is thought to act as a proxy for internal mechanical tension. In other words, instead of tension being generated primarily by heavy external load, tension is being generated from within the muscle cell itself, as fluid accumulates and increases pressure on the cytoskeleton. This internal pressure appears to activate several anabolic signaling pathways, which are classically associated with muscle adaptation. So when you step back and look at the whole picture, eccentric strength training improved by roughly 9 to 13% in both groups. Power changes were minimal and similar. Soreness responses were comparable, but the internal stimulus was very different. The BFR condition produced a markedly greater muscle swelling response, which the authors suggest may act as a key mechanistic driver of adaptation in low-load BFR training. One point that I feel is worth flagging is the unilateral crossover design, and the authors didn't really discuss the potential for contralateral training effects. Although I've covered elements of this concept in previous episodes, contralateral training effects refers to the phenomenon where training one limb leads to strength gains in the opposite limb. This isn't because the muscle itself is getting stronger, but because of neural adaptations at the level of the brain and spinal cord. Essentially, the nervous system becomes better at producing force, and some of that improvement carries over to the other side. Given what we know about cross-education, especially with eccentric training, in my opinion, it could be possible that some of the strength gains in each limb weren't purely local. That doesn't invalidate the findings, but it does mean the true difference between low-load BFR and high-load eccentrics could potentially be slightly masked. Now let's move on to the second study, which asks a slightly different but equally important question. This study was published in the Journal of Clinical Medicine and is titled The Effect of Combining BFR with the Nordic Hamstring Exercise on Hamstring Strength. Where the first study examined BFR as a substitute for high mechanical load, this paper explores whether BFR adds any additional benefit when laid on top of an already demanding eccentric exercise, the Nordic hamstring curl. Unlike the first study, this isn't about replacing load, it's about what happens when load is already very high. The participants in the study were trained female volleyball athletes, and they were randomly assigned into 3 groups: a Nordic hamstring exercise group, a Nordic hamstring exercise combined with BFR group, and a control group who continued their regular volleyball training, while the other 2 groups added, and each set was taken to volitional failure. To standardize a full repetition, the athlete had to reach 40 degrees under control. From here, the athletes were allowed to use their arms and hands to dampen the fall and allow their chest to touch the surface, where they immediately return to the starting position by pushing the ground with their hands. For the Nordic plus BFR group, the only difference was the addition of BFR cuffs, which was placed on both thighs and inflated to 70% of individual limb occlusion pressure. The cuffs were inflated only during the exercise sets. Both training groups performed each set to failure, with rest periods of 2 minutes between sets. Once again, the key difference was the presence or absence of BFR. Moving on to what they measured, the primary outcome was eccentric hamstring strength, assessed by using a Nordic-specific testing device, allowing the authors to quantify peak eccentric force. They also tracked training volume, calculated as the total number of Nordic repetitions completed across the 6-week training period. When we look at the paper and you dig into it a little bit more detail, they actually started to discuss the difference between dominant and non-dominant limbs. Rather than getting lost in the minutiae of that result, what I'm going to rather do is just look at the results at the group level, because both limbs responded in essentially the same way. Across the 6-week intervention, both the Nordic-only group and the Nordic plus BFR group demonstrated large and statistically significant improvements in eccentric hamstring strength and average power. In practical terms, peak eccentric torque and average power increased by approximately 45 to 60% in both training groups, with very large effects for both training groups and no meaningful differences between BFR and the non-BFR training group. From a pure strength perspective, both approaches were highly effective, and adding BFR did not further amplify the magnitude of adaptation. Where the two approaches clearly diverged was in training volume. Over the 6-week program, the Nordic-only group accumulated approximately 3,400 to 3,500 total repetitions, whereas the Nordic plus BFR group accumulated a much lower number, closer to 2,200 to 2,300 repetitions. That's a reduction in total eccentric training volume of roughly 1/3, whilst achieving the same strength outcomes. The Nordic plus BFR group also demonstrated a significant improvement in bilateral symmetry, which was not observed in the Nordic-only group, suggesting a potential neuromuscular efficiency benefit rather than a structural strength advantage. So when you zoom out, the key finding is not that BFR makes the Nordic hamstring exercise stronger, but rather it makes it more efficient, which has clear implications for fatigue management, session density, and overall program design in hamstring rehab and performance contexts. From a programming perspective, I feel this is a really important finding. The Nordic hamstring exercise is already highly demanding. When you combine that with the reality of rehab or performance programs, where athletes are rarely doing just one exercise, total workload becomes a major consideration. In a real-world hamstring rehab setting, athletes are usually performing a host of additional rehab-based exercises, running, and sport-specific training on top of gym-based work. The ability to achieve the same eccentric strength outcome with fewer Nordic repetitions creates room in the program. It reduces fatigue, potentially limits excessive soreness, and allows the coach to introduce multiple exercises within the same session or microcycle without exceeding the athlete's recovery capacity. When this study is viewed alongside the first paper, for me, a very clear framework begins to emerge. BFR can be used as a load management strategy when high loads are not appropriate, and a volume management strategy when high-intensity eccentrics are already present. And that distinction is critical for intelligent hamstring injury rehab and performance programming. Before wrapping up, it's useful to step back and ask a very practical question. When does it actually make sense to combine BFR with Nordic hamstring exercises? For me, based on the two studies we've just discussed, a simple framework starts to emerge. If the athlete is early in rehab or in a phase where high mechanical loads are not well tolerated, then BFR is likely more useful as a load substitution strategy. That's where the first study fits. Low-load eccentric training with BFR can maintain or rebuild eccentric hamstring strength without relying on heavy external resistance, which may not be appropriate at this stage. If the athlete is later in rehabilitation, returning to higher intensity training, or already performing Nordics as part of a broader program, then BFR becomes more useful as a volume and fatigue management tool, rather than as a strength amplifier. This is where the second study fits. If Nordics are already being performed to high effort, adding BFR doesn't appear to increase strength outcomes, but it does allow the same outcomes to be achieved with significantly fewer total repetitions, which can be valuable when time, recovery, or overall workload are limiting factors. So in very simple terms, if load tolerance is the main issue, BFR helps you train around external load. If fatigue and volume are main issues, BFR helps you train around volume. That distinction matters because hamstring rehab and performance programs are rarely linear. Athletes are sprinting, lifting, performing running drills, and often all at the same time. Decisions are rarely about whether an exercise works in isolation, but whether it fits into the broader training system without tipping the athlete over the edge. When you bring both studies together, the bigger picture becomes much clearer. So rather than asking whether BFR is better or worse than traditional eccentric training, the more useful question is, what problem are we trying to solve? Blood flow restriction isn't a replacement for eccentric hamstring training. It's a programming lever, one that allows us to manipulate load, volume, and internal stress in a more flexible way, depending on whether the athlete is in their rehab or performance cycle. And when used that way, it can be a very powerful addition to hamstring injury management. And that's where we'll leave this episode. Hope you really enjoyed it and how I was able to actually frame the way I've been able to use BFR in different elements or different stages of a hamstring program. And if you do have any questions related to this, you can get in touch with me through my website or socials, which is at thebfr.co. You can purchase your own BFR cuffs from our website, and you can find it at www.thebfr.co. And lastly, before I go, a couple of favors from me to you. If you know of someone who would benefit from this episode, please share it. And if you are enjoying the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes. Thanks for listening, and remember to keep the pump.